Danny here from the Joshua Tree, and thanks for joining us. We're back in person on Sundays at 10 a.m, but for those of you joining us online, we continue our series and finish our series in the book of Joshua today, looking at Joshua 22 to 24. It's been a great journey as God's people have inhabited the land that God has promised, the land that God has delivered. And here we see the concluding words from Joshua, the leader of God's people at this point, as he gives a concluding message about what life is going forward for the people who now dwell in the land. And so he begins with an address towards those tribes who settled on the east of the river, who were established under the leadership of Moses in somewhat controversial situations. And so it's a message for them to encourage them to step forward in this next phase and to walk by faith. Verse 2, "You have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, and you've obeyed me in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your fellow Israelites, but have carried on the mission the Lord your God gave you. Now that the Lord your God has given them rest as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side." Moses commends them for having started well, for playing their part in helping the western tribes to conquer and inhabit the land that God was giving. And now he's encouraging them as they return, encouraging them to remain focused. Verse 5, "But be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." There's an exhortation here for the tribes on the east of the Jordan to continue to love God, for generations to come to walk with him, to keep his commands, to hold fast to his truths, and to ultimately serve him. And so what this is an emphasis that we see in Joshua's concluding messages to the whole of Israel, to emphasize that they have an opportunity. They have an opportunity going forward, an opportunity for them to either serve and worship God or to turn from him to other things. And so Joshua's encouragement is that they've started well, and he exhorts them to continue to take the opportunity before them to honour and serve God. And so we see in the verses that follow that before these tribes cross to the Jordan, back to the land that's given to them, that they establish this altar. And it's an altar where offerings can be made. But we see from verse 16 how this event is interpreted. The whole assembly of the Lord, those on the west of the Jordan, said, "How could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him now? Was not the sin of Peor enough for us? Up to this very day we have not cleansed ourselves from that sin, even though a plague fell on the community of the Lord. And are you now turning away from the Lord?" There are 4 questions that are being asked in this interrogation from the greater tribes of Israel about this altar that's being built. The controversy is that in Deuteronomy it was outlined that there is to be just one altar for the people of God to be able to offer sacrifices and commune with God. And so this interrogation shows that there's great concern about this act. The first question, how could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? And they've interpreted this construction of an altar as a sign of betrayal, as a sign of breaking of the relationship. And the second question, how could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him? There's sort of this perception that they've moved from God towards self, that they've not sought his direction and lead, but come up with their own initiative. And in doing so, having turned away from the God who'd established their land. The third question, was not the sin of Peor enough for us? There's these allusions back to the incident in Numbers where there was immorality and idolatry in the worshipping of other things, worshipping in practices and ways that was contrary to God's direction. The Israelites are saying to those east of the Jordan, have you forgotten the past? Have you forgotten what judgment came about because of that? And then finally, and are you now turning away from the Lord? There's a clear question here about where their future trajectory is. And there's a concern about the results of this action. We see that from verse 18. If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he'll be angry with the whole community of Israel. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and share the land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves, other than the altar of the Lord our God. When Achan son of Zerah was unfaithful in regard to the devoted things, did not wrath come on the whole community of Israel? He was not the only one who had died for his sin. The warning here is about the sins of the past. Don't you remember what happened with Achan? When he didn't follow the Lord's instructions, when he sought his own initiative, it stirred God's anger, it brought about God's wrath. There was judgment on the people. And so there's a fear here that this action of constructing this altar is going to have grave consequences for the wider community. As those tribes on the east respond to these questions and this interrogation, we see them reveal their motive. Verse 22, the mighty one, God the Lord, the mighty one, God the Lord, he knows, and let Israel know. If this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord and to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings, or to sacrifice fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord himself call us to account, be accountable to God for their actions. But they do reveal the motive that drove them from verse 24. We did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord. So your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. That is why we said, let us get ready and build an altar, but not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. On the contrary, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and fellowship offerings. We see here that there were some good motives. There was a fear that for generations to come, there might be an opportunity for them to forget. And so rather, they wanted to build this altar to provide an opportunity to worship, as a witness, as a sign of what God had done, about who they were as a unified people. And so having heard this explanation, the tribes on the west of the Jordan realized that this is a sign that has a great symbolic value, a witness, a testimony to all that God had done in bringing his people from slavery towards inhabiting this land, that there was a unity that transcended even the Jordan River that was contained within these 12 tribes. And so then chapter 23, it goes to Joshua's discussion with the tribes on the west of the Jordan. It's a concluding message where Joshua retraces everything that's happened. He says from verse 1, after a long time had passed and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua by then, a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges and officials, and said to them, I am very old. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Again, it's a reminder in this concluding message that God has been active, that they have been able to witness his purposes being realized, that God had not only made plans, but delivered on his promise. And so in this concluding message, again, he exhorts them to make the most of the opportunity that God is delivering them as they live in the land. Verse 6, be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. Again, there's this encouragement to be strong and careful, to not turn from God towards other things, to not be influenced by other alternative belief systems. And again, we see that within these tribes, there is a remnant of the Canaanites. It hasn't been total annihilation. And so in this next generation and the generations to come, there's going to be continued opportunities to either trust God or turn to other things, to worship him alone or to worship other idols. And so the encouragement for God's people is to hold fast. And the reminder is verse 9, the Lord has driven out before you great and powerful nations. To this day, no one has been able to withstand you. Or one of your routes, 1,000, because the Lord your God fights for you, just as he promised. So be very careful to love the Lord your God. Again, it's a reminder of the powerful things that God has done and an exhortation to love him most. Out of their love and commitment to him will flow an allegiance that will be seen in their life of service and worship. Joshua concludes, now I'm about to go the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. But just as all the good things the Lord your God has promised you have come to you, so he will bring on you all the evil things he has threatened, until the Lord your God has destroyed you from this good land he has given you. If you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you'll quickly perish from the good land he has given you. Again, we hear the message. God delivered on his promise. But there's a great warning about the opportunity that is before them. There is an opportunity to turn away from God. The great problem of the human heart is that we gravitate towards things other than God for our ultimate love and devotion. And so Joshua, in these final words to those who lived on the west of the Jordan, was to heed the warning, to be wary of where their hearts drifted, where they were giving of themselves in service and worship to things other than ultimately the God who had delivered on his promise. So this concluding message continues in chapter 24. We see it's located in Shechem, where the leaders of all the tribes assemble. Verse 1, then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Then Joshua retraces the steps, the promise from Abraham, all the way through to the deliverance into the land. God had a plan and he delivered on it. God made promises that he fulfilled. And so now the response for the people who are recipients of this land inheritance. Verse 14, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. The right response as the recipients of what God has done was to fear him and serve him. Throw away alternatives as the object of our devotion and allegiance, but rather to serve the Lord wholeheartedly, to serve him as a household, as a family unit, to show allegiance to him and him alone. And so this exhortation is responded to in the affirmative. Verse 16, the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve the other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt, from that land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we travelled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord, because he is our God." Service is in connection to an allegiance. It flows from the identity of being God's people, that we would be partakers in God's work. But it's not easy. And so Joshua presses in on them. It's easy to say things, but will they actually do it? Joshua said to the people, "You're not able to serve the Lord. He's a holy God. He's a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you." And Joshua, like a good leader, is laying out the conditions that are before people. He's not trying to sugarcoat things or pretend that this is easy. He is warning them that their hearts will have a battle of allegiance. And he is inviting them to demonstrate their allegiance by pushing away other objects of affection and devoting themselves totally to the Lord. And so the people, verse 21, said, "No, we will serve the Lord." Then Joshua said, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord." "Yes, we are witnesses," they replied. "Now then," said Joshua, "throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." And the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." It's a bit like a coach, sort of a pre-game prep talk, getting them to sort of recite the plays that they're going to do, their determination, their resolve, their allegiance to the game plan. God's people have an opportunity to worship and serve him. There's an opportunity to do that, but there's also the option to serve and worship other things. Concluding message carries weight. Verse 25. On that day Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. "See," he said to all the people, "this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God." Then Joshua dismissed the people, each to their own inheritance. Many times in the book of Joshua, these stone memorials have been a reminder of God's provision or God's punishment. There were stones constructed to remind them about where God had delivered them through the Jordan. There were stones to remember the sin of Achan and the punishment that came on his household. And here there is a stone assembled to remember the covenant, the affirmation of all that God had done in delivering them their land, and the affirmation of the people that they would serve and worship him alone. And so all the leaders and the people returned to their various locations throughout the promised land. And it's there that they have the opportunity to actually realize the commitment that they've made, to actually put their words into practice, to actually love God, to walk in obedience to him. It's in their day-to-day life where they'll be seen to keep their commands, to serve him, to hold to him, to honour him. It's there that they have the opportunity to witness to future generations, to share the stories of what God has done and what God has promised to provide for his people. It's there in their lives that they have the opportunity to hold fast to the Lord. There will be pressure. There will be options to hold on to other things, to pursue other means, to serve other agendas. And that is the same situation that presents each of us. And now the great inheritance that we who live in 2021 hold is the inheritance that Jesus has established. And as we saw last week, it's not an earthly inheritance that's defined by geographical boundaries, but it's an eternal inheritance that is bound and encapsulated in a perfect relationship with God, where we are free from sin, where we will be able to give of ourselves totally in allegiance to Him, where we won't be torn and there won't be other objects that are vying for our affections. But in this day where we wait for that inheritance to be realised, we have the opportunity also to serve and worship the one true God. We live in a day where we are offered other options to give of our time and our energy and our giftings and our minds to. We have great dangers about idols, the things that we can identify as the things that define us, rather than the identity that God gives us Himself. And so these words are an encouragement to us to fear the Lord and to serve Him, to throw away the gods that are around us, to hold, to bear witness in this world of the great saving work that God has established, the great promise that He offers, the hope that is found in Jesus. And we have the opportunity to serve and worship God. Friends, when we see that as a framework for our life, it reshapes things. In our world where burden and service, doing things out of obligation, is really seen as a crushing of self, where freedom and liberation and pursuing our deepest desires is upheld as true living, we see here an alternative. That true life is understanding who we are, understanding whose we are, understanding that God has been delivering us a true and eternal identity, and that serving and worshipping Him is the purpose with which we have the opportunity to frame our lives by on now. And it's an opportunity to be partakers in something that won't just diminish and crumble and be forgotten, but will be something that lasts into eternity. So friends, this is the opportunity that God presents each of us to fear Him, to serve Him, to worship Him alone. Embrace the opportunity and live a life that is pleasing to Him. Live a life that flows into eternity.